In the vibrant but often complex environment of Los Angeles, where the sun shines almost every day and the stars dazzle with their glamour, lay the life of Laura Martinez. Laura was a millionaire businesswoman, known not only for her considerable wealth but also for her beauty and her charity. With long, straight hair and facial features reminiscent of actresses from the golden age of Hollywood, Laura was the kind of person who lit up any room she entered. However, despite her success and love for helping others, beneath the surface of her glamorous life lay a story of fear and vulnerability. On the other hand, Marco Ruiz's name echoed through the halls of the Los Angeles Police Department. Marco, a 35-year-old police officer, was a robust man, with an imposing stature and dark eyes that could be both kind and intimidating. With a disarming smile, he had had a clear career in the police force, but in recent years, his personal life had become increasingly complicated. The rising cost of living and the lack of incentives in his salary had left him trapped in a cycle of debt. Marco began to get involved in the culture of shadow work, an activity that, although many saw it as a means to an end, had the potential to ruin his professional life. His boss, Captain Samuel Ortiz, was a shrewd and charismatic-looking man. Samuel, in his mid-40s, was known for being a fair but tough leader. With graying hair and an air of authority, he always tried to keep morale high in his team, but there was a deep sense of frustration when faced with the realities of a declining budget and growing public distrust of the police. Meanwhile, he tried to deal with his own internal conflicts, including a hidden addiction to a blood pressure pill, which, if discovered, could mean the end of his career. As the days passed in Los Angeles, stories of interactions between the wealthy community and the police intertwined. Marco, feeling overwhelmed by the pressure of supporting his family and dealing with his own ghosts, found himself on more than one occasion crossing lines he never thought he would. The lack of opportunities had pushed him down a dark path, a path that only intensified with each small abuse of power that came his way. One afternoon, as Marco and his partner, Officer Luis Gonzalez, patrolled the streets of Beverly Hills, their eyes fell upon an impressive mansion, whose grandeur was only surpassed by the well-known luxury of its owners. This was the residence of Laura Martinez, a woman who had been seen as a symbol of success, but who was actually struggling in her own personal life, dealing with a past she could not leave behind. For weeks, Laura's financial situation began to take a deeper toll on her than she could have anticipated. Understandably, the pressure of the corporate world, coupled with a marriage that felt increasingly distant. Her husband, Javier, a man who had been a rising star in the tech world, was now in a period of job uncertainty, made her question her own emotional stability. Laura often found herself at home, silent, surrounded by luxury, but yearning for a genuine connection with her husband. Yet behind the lavish events they attended lay unhappy weeks. Javier grew increasingly frustrated with his own career, which only increased the tension in their relationship. He often retreated into his office, working long hours and leaving Laura alone in the vast home they had built together. His silence became an echo in every corner of the house. Meanwhile, Marco's tensions at work were mounting. There were weeks when he couldn't provide for his family more than the bare minimum, and in his mind, the wrong decisions he had made in his career were beginning to pile up like a destructive impact. He and Luis, friends since the police academy, began to enjoy certain perks of life in Beverly Hills. A dinner here and a gift there to soften the rich began to perpetuate the idea that they could get away with more than just the basics to live on. In this tense environment, the day Marco and Luis were assigned to respond to a call related to security in the Laura neighborhood was the beginning of an unexpected and tragic turn. Despite Captain Ortiz's warnings about the importance of maintaining police ethics, the reality was that Marco was sinking into an abyss from which he believed he could not escape. The day of the call, it seemed to be routine, an alert of a stranger lurking on the property of a woman everyone in the community knew. When they arrived, they found Laura in the garden, talking on the phone. It was a sunny day, but despite the rays, fear enveloped her. Marco approached her, immediately feeling a unique connection that led him to deviate from his duty. Laura's words, her vulnerability, and her beauty created a space in which he saw more than just a security situation. As they talked, their eyes met, and in that moment, Marco realized there was more at stake than met the eye. Over time, Laura's life calling and Marco's struggles began to intertwine in unexpected ways. However, Marco had crossed the line. Would he be able to resist temptation, or would he fall into a spiral of power abuse that would test not only his career, but also his own morality? The next few weeks would define the future of all involved. Time passed quickly after that first meeting between Marco and Laura. Even though it had been a routine situation, something inside Marco had ignited. That fleeting conversation in the garden of Lara's mansion left a spark in his mind, something he couldn't ignore. He felt drawn to her, not only for her beauty, but for her fragility and her story. What started as a police job soon turned into something more complicated. Aware of his growing interest, Lara tried to maintain a professional distance in her interactions with Marco. However, circumstances in her personal life were becoming more and more of a burden. Javier, her husband, seemed more distant by the day, caught up in his own work concerns and increasingly emotionally absent. The mansion, once the epitome of happiness and success, now felt cold and empty, a reflection of her loneliness. It was on one of those cold, lonely nights that Marco received an emergency call from Lara's house. When he arrived, he found a scene that left him on the edge of the emotional abyss. Lara was visibly distressed, with tears in her eyes, and more vulnerable than ever. Apparently, she had received anonymous threats, which she was assured were related to her professional success. The police officer's role as protector began to become something more personal. "Marco, I don't know who else to turn to. I'm scared," Lara confessed, her voice shaky and desperate. Marco felt an immediate urge to protect her, to be there to support her, but at the same time, his professional instincts were fighting with his emotions. In that moment, he could see the vulnerability in her, and though he tried to keep his distance, he soon began to cross boundaries he shouldn't have. Taking advantage of his role as a law enforcement officer, Marco decided to visit her more frequently under the pretext of checking on her and making sure she was safe. Each visit brought him closer to Lara, and each time they met, the chemistry between them grew more intense. Marco began to use his authority to enter Lara's life in a more intimate way. During these visits, Lara shared with Marco more about her past, her struggle to achieve success, the difficult decisions she had made, and her desire to change and leave behind a life of partying and excess. Although she had achieved an evidently admirable transformation, that honesty also caused Marco to begin to question himself. In his mind, the search for meaning behind his life as a police officer became an internal struggle against his own morality. On one such visit, while checking on the security of her home and touring the mansion, Lara showed him her study. Decorated with artwork and photos from charity events, the room also contained memories of a not-so-bright past. Backed by the wall, Lara began to talk about her past experiences, revealing her vulnerability. Because of her overwhelming desire to be accepted into high society, she had made mistakes that had led her into compromising situations. "Marco, you may not know this, but I wasn't always like this. I've had to fight my own demons. I've lost a lot of people along the way," she said, her voice cracking. This kind of confidence only served to trap Marco further into her world. The lines between duty and desire soon began to blur. However, the situation was not limited to just emotional growth. Marco, seeking something more than friendship with Lara, began to take advantage of his position of authority. Under the pressure of life and a growing strain on his finances, he began to cross ethical lines. With each visit, the tone of their interactions became bolder and less professional. One day, while checking the security of their home, Marco touched her arm, and Lara, startled, turned around, meeting his intense gaze. The two fell into a tense silence, full of unexplored possibilities. But not everything was easy. Javier, increasingly concerned about his wife's distress, began to suspect that something strange was going on. The emotional distance between them was affecting their marriage, but Javier also noticed that Lara was spending more time with a cop. His instincts told him that something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. In an act of desperation, Javier decided to involve his best friend, Daniel, a man with many connections in the police force. Daniel knew Marco from the academy and followed his career closely. The idea was simple: talk to him and find out what was going on. However, little did Javier know about the dark path Marco had taken. As tensions mounted, the atmosphere at Lara's mansion became increasingly volatile. Marco continued to push the boundaries of his relationship with the millionaire's wife, enjoying the attention he was receiving, even while knowing he was causing harm. One day, Lara, feeling overwhelmed by the pressure of her relationship with Marco and confronted by the emotional void her marriage was suffering, decided to make a decision. She called her therapist, seeking guidance in a moment of weakness. By talking to her, Lara was able to see the situation from a different perspective. Tired of living in the shadows, she decided it was time to act. Meanwhile, Javier's concern began to materialize when he finally confronted Marco at a chance meeting. The encounter was tense, filled with furtive glances and unasked questions. Javier began to talk about concerns for his wife's safety, alluding to rumors in the neighborhood. Back in his office, Marco felt the pressure mounting, but still, his ego and need to maintain his connection with Lara made him ignore the warning. It was in this climate of accumulated tension that an event finally occurred that would change the course of history. One night, after several increasingly suspicious encounters between Marco and Lara, Javier decided to look for evidence. He set up a hidden security camera in his house, connected to his phone, without Lara knowing. He wanted to be sure that his wife was okay and that there was nothing strange in her professional life. Meanwhile, Marco and Lara continued to pursue a path that could ultimately be destructive. Marco found himself caught between his desire for Lara and concerns about the legal and ethical implications of his actions. Unaware that he was being watched, he plunged into his role, convinced that he had come to know Lara in ways that no one else had. However, the truth always finds a way to come to light. By reviewing the recordings, Javier soon discovered the nature of the relationship between his wife and Marco. Every emotion, every gesture, was recorded on his phone screen as a reminder of the pain he had been ignoring. The betrayal hit like a fist, and helplessness was transformed into a desire for justice and protection from his wife. The discovery was devastating for Javier. He was faced with the harsh reality of his marriage and, in an instant, the world he had built crumbled. With his heart heavy and anger building, he knew he had to act immediately. Marco and Lara's relationship was about to reach its most critical point. Without realizing it, both found themselves in a chaos that would soon unfold, touching the lives of everyone involved. As the story began to reach its climax, the tension in Los Angeles grew even more. Martinez's mansion reached a critical point. The lives of everyone involved were hanging in the balance, and the revelation of Marco and Lara's inappropriate relationship threatened to shatter their world. Installing the security camera proved to be a crucial decision for Javier. On the screen, he saw with his own eyes the interactions between his wife and the police officer, their knowing laughter, the way Marco got a little too close to Lara, the fragility with which she confided her fears and longings to him. Javier's eyes filled with fury and pain, turning his heart into a battlefield. Determined to confront the situation, Javier prepared to face Lara. When they finally met that night, he was full of both trust and distrust. With the camera still rolling, they began a conversation that promised to change the course of their lives. "Lara," Javier began, his voice tense but controlled. "What's going on between you and Marco?" Lara, shocked and scared, felt the air freeze around her. "What are you talking about?" She tried to steer the conversation away, but Javier wasn't having it. He'd seen enough. "Don't tell me you don't know what I'm talking about. The recordings don't lie, Lara. I saw you with him." That's when the truth came out. Lara, faced with the reality of her choices and her relationship with Marco, began to cry. "Javier, it's not what you think," she pleaded, but her words rang hollow, even to her. Helplessness and despair filled the room, and Javier felt his resistance wearing away. In the end, his wife's betrayal and the very essence of his marriage were crumbling like a house of cards. The conversation quickly turned into an emotional storm. Laris felt guilt and fear. Javier was a mix of anger and sadness. However, Javier wasn't just worried about their relationship. His mind was also occupied with something else. Marco had crossed an inexcusable line, and now Javier knew he had to take action. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Marco continued in his own emotional turmoil. Feeling closer to Lara, he had begun to imagine a future with her, ignoring the consequences of his actions. That night, however, his intuition told him that something had changed. There was a tension in the air, a pulsation that filled him with unease. However, he had no idea that the time to face his own destiny was near. That's when Javier decided to seek help from his friend Daniel, who had connections not only in the police force, but also in the judicial system. Javier knew that Marco could be a corrupt officer, someone who had abused his authority to manipulate his wife. But he wanted to make sure his suspicions were correct, so he took his findings to Daniel. "We have to act," Javier told her, his voice full of determination. "Not just for me and Lara, but for everyone who could be a victim of this kind of abuse." With Daniel's help, Javier arranged a meeting with Captain Samuel Ortiz. He knew Samuel was a fair leader who would not tolerate corruption in his department. However, he also knew Samuel was dealing with his own issues, and this could be a bigger challenge. As Javier sat across from him, the tension in the room was palpable. "Captain, I need to talk to you about Marco Ruiz," Javier began, his voice firm and full of conviction. Samuel frowned, but didn't interrupt. "I've been watching you, and I believe you've been abusing your power. My wife has been a victim of your manipulation." Samuel was silent for a moment, considering each word. Javier continued to explain everything he had discovered, even the intimate interactions between Lara and Marco. Each statement was a blow, but the captain knew he had to listen. The community's trust in his department was at stake, and he couldn't let one officer ruin that. "I'll look into this immediately," Samuel finally said, his deep voice echoing in the room. "If what you say is true, Marco will not only be fired, but he will face criminal charges." Thanks to the captain's quick action, an investigation was launched. In the days that followed, Marco felt increasingly anxious. Suspicion loomed over him with every glance he received from his companions. Despite his attempts to remain normal, he knew something was not right. When he found out that Javier had been talking to Samuel, a shadow of panic crossed his face. The life he had built on lies and manipulation was about to crumble. In the next round of interrogations, the truth finally began to emerge. Samuel held a series of meetings with the officers who had been involved in the interactions with Lara, and the story began to fall into place. Every suspicion Javier had had, every little sign he had noticed about Marco's inappropriate behavior, became concrete evidence of his abuse of power. Meanwhile, Lara was dealing with the regrets of her own decisions. She realized that she had let her vulnerabilities lead her to a dark place, where boundaries became blurred. Still, she knew she had caused irreparable damage to her marriage, and with each day she spent in the mansion, she felt more lost. The story of her life of luxury was now spiraling into horror. Finally, the day of confrontation arrived. At a meeting between the police department, Lara, and Javier, evidence of Marco's abuse was presented. Through tears, Lara shared her side of the story, including the threats she had received and her internal struggles. Her confession resonated, and the weight of her actions was felt in the room. Javier, at her side, felt revitalized by her honesty, but he knew the scar of betrayal would still be there. As Samuel finished outlining all the evidence against Marco, the officer turned unusually pale. He couldn't believe that his entire world was about to come crashing down. However, his defensive nature intensified, and despite all the evidence, he began to flatly deny every accusation. "It's not true. I didn't do anything that wasn't to help her," he exclaimed, even as reality loomed over him. But there was no turning back. Captain Ortiz led Marco's charge. "Marco Ruiz, you are fired from the force. In addition, you will be investigated on charges of abuse of power and harassment. You must know that actions have consequences." The echo of her statement resonated in the room, and the words cut deep into Marco's skin. Adrenaline and anger began to manifest in him, and when he was arrested, he realized that his world had ended. It was a sudden and stark shift in reality, a brutal reminder of what he had caused. The court process for Marco was swift. As the case progressed, public pressure grew. Lara, though broken, found strength in her decision to speak out. With the support of Javier and a network of well-established friends, she was able to begin rebuilding her life. Despite the pain she had faced, she became a voice for those who had been victims of abuse of power, sharing her story and helping others find healing. Ultimately, Marco was convicted. The justice Javier sought had been served, but not without a high emotional cost. The relationship between him and Lara began to heal over time, though the scars would remain. They both understood that the road to recovery would take time, effort, and commitment. As the sun set over Los Angeles, a new life began to unfold. Lara had found herself again, transforming her pain into purpose. Javier, though hurt, was also beginning to find peace in his life, salvaging what was left of his marriage and reconnecting with his wife. The story of Lara, Marco, and Javier became a lesson in power, vulnerability, and the fight for truth. The echoes of their experiences would resonate beyond their own story, and the city that was once their home became the scene of a profound transformation. For some, the memory of their choices would become a warning. For others, a call for justice. Like any good true crime documentary, this story ended with a clear message. The truth will always come out, and abuse of power should never be tolerated. In an ever-evolving society, the struggle remains the same: to protect the vulnerable and ensure that those who abuse their authority face the consequences of their actions. Life goes on, but the lessons learned will remain.